Welcome everybody to our session today as part of our grant work for improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. Know that you can access all of today's resources as well as previous sessions and upcoming sessions as well by scanning this QR code or entering the bit.ly link into your computer browser. Know that every resource that we share with you will be available there in that Padlet, will remain there in perpetuity as long as we have access to those documents ourselves, and feel free to reshare, remake, make it your own. Know that these are resources available to you and to your peers at no cost and are definitely available for you to use as appropriate. To facilitate us knowing who's here, who's joining us, and to make any adjustments either to pacing or content, please let us know either by dropping it in the chat or by renaming your Zoom ID, including your name, district, COE, or SELPA that you're representing today, and your current position. Again, as Debbie mentioned earlier today, it's 4 of us in our team: Lupita, Olguin-rubio, who will be co-presenting with me today, and our senior director here at Imperial County SELPA, Dr. Deborah Montoya, Christina Zavala, our newest addition to our team. We're very happy to have her with us as a SELPA coordinator, and then myself, also a coordinator here at Imperial County SELPA. Also, as a reminder, we're part of the One System of Support of the state of California. We represent a SELPA content lead in the area of all things English learners with disabilities. And here's our little corner of heaven tucked away in that neat little area between Arizona and California, just north of the Mexican border. So that should give you an idea to our demographics in our rural location. We started last session with going over some data, some numbers, some percentages related to English learners and English learners with disabilities, knowing that there is a huge overlap. Also, prior to us getting started, we want to remind you that the guidance provided in the California Practitioner's Guide are a series of best practices, except for those statutes, regulations, and court decisions referenced wherein. As we shared with you, we started off with Section 1, Chapter 1 in our previous session. Today, we're going to continue with Section 1 of the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. The content is divided into 5 sections that are very much arranged in the process of identification as an English learner, potential referral, the MTSS process, the pre-referral referral process, all the way through the development of the IEP, instructional strategies, proposing exit from SPED, and reclassification. Today, we are still in the world of Section 1, specifically Chapter 2 today, with the following topics. Today, we are going to be focusing on supports for English learners within the MTSS framework. Again, as a reminder, this is all under Section 1, and this is Chapter 2, the culminating chapter for this section. In our previous session, we also introduced you to the structure of the content that we will be presenting. The California Practitioner's Guide has a series of questions that lead up the content as we enter into the work. There is a section for questions addressed in the chapter for teachers, as well as a section for administrators. These 2 questions are the ones that we are going to be focusing on today, given our audience. And the 2 questions for administrators I addressed here are: what systems and structures need to be in place to ensure an equitable, inclusive, and effective MTSS framework that will support English learners, multilingual learners in my school or LEA? Additionally, we're also going to look at what school or LEA-wide systems and services need to be in place to ensure that appropriate and informed student-centered decisions are made prior to any thought of referral or pre-referral activities for special education evaluation. To facilitate this process, because we know that it can be a little daunting to keep track with so much information, we've developed a series of supports. We're firm believers in practicing what we preach, and we know that as adult learners, we learn in a variety of ways, just as we prepare in teacher ed programs, administration programs to address the needs of our students and to align our way of presenting in a way that will make more sense to our learners. The same holds true for us as adult learners. So we've developed a series of resources that can support you in taking this work, this very valuable work, back to your sites. So as you can see here off to the corner, embedded within this slide is an infographic. We developed these infographics that follow the order in every single chapter of the California Practitioner's Guide. We wanted to ensure that when practitioners, and in this case, you administrators, can have a tool, a visual tool, a resource, a pacer to take some of this content back to support practitioners in your site in learning more about the MTSS process and also how it applies to English learners prior to any pre-referral activities that might lead to potential assessment for eligibility criteria for a disability. So I'm going to go ahead and pop open this infographic just to show you how to navigate it. One of the missing steps oftentimes with the resources is that we don't go over how to use them or multiple ways on how to use them. So I want to take a minute or two to guide you through this process. Again, like in chapter 1's infographic, all of the links here are active links. They're live links. So by hovering, you'll see that wherever you see my little hand here, that gives me an indication that this is a live link. By clicking on this section right here, you'll go directly to the California Practitioner's Guide in its entirety. If you click on this chapter title or the chapter number, it will take you to that specific chapter of the California Practitioner's Guide with no need of having to rely on indexing to be able to navigate the document. Clicking on section 1 will take you to the beginning of section 1. Now here is where it gets interesting. So I know that your time with staff might be limited at some point, and you might have to share some of this information out in manageable, digestible little nuggets, right? So what we've done is we've made these resources available for you so that you can present it in chunks. So say that you have only a certain amount of minutes to talk about an introduction and overview of the MTSS framework. All you would need to focus on would be this section right here. Clicking on the titles and the sections will take you directly to the actual document, meaning the California Practitioner's Guide, that will allow you then to access the resources. Also, whenever you see a link that says table or appendix, it will take you directly to that document. So then this serves as a pacer for you as you're sharing some of the information with your staff, and also as a refresher as you return to your sites either later on today, tomorrow, or anytime when you might need to access this information, as a refresher of what was covered, what was shared with you, and where exactly in the document you can find additional information that is going to support the work you're doing with staff. So again, all of this included in every single one of our sections, including frequently asked questions related to the topics covered in chapter 2. So if you want to take a look at those most frequently recurring questions and answers that are linked to statutes, regulations if applicable, that is available here in this section, including a student scenario. So again, oftentimes we need a model of best practices, a vignette to show us the process that a team might go through that would illustrate the process presented in the chapter. The student scenarios do just that. Know that every single one of our infographics has a section like that as well that links you back to the student scenario in the Practitioner's Guide that illustrates best practices in relation to the topic covered. All right. So let's get back into it. So chapter 2, as previously alluded to, is focused on the MTSS framework and how the framework is designed to support all students, and how will we explicitly leverage the MTSS framework to specifically support multilingual learners, English learners. The chapter provides guidance for a systematic pre-referral process to help us in avoiding over-identification and under-identification of English learners, multilingual learners needing special education services. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to the experts. I'm a firm believer in if somebody else said it better than you, let them say it. So here we have two practitioners sharing about over and under identifications of ELs in special education. I'm going to go ahead and click and give you a break from my voice for a couple of minutes.
I wonder if we could take a 30,000 foot view for a minute in terms of both over and under identification of English language learners in special education, and why both of those things happen and why it's so hard.
Right. When you look broadly at it, really in places that have significant amount of ELL support, bilingual education, ESL support, really systems that are looking at culturally and linguistically appropriate practices, the percentages of ELL students who also have special education needs end up being really close to monolingual English children. So the percentages are about the same. When you move away from those, and you are in systems that maybe either don't have the resources or are learning about serving English language learners, so there aren't enough services or supports to address their language learning needs, then often we want students to get help. So then often, because special education is there, that seems to be the first place that people go. But for English language learners who are really just in that process, who they may be having challenges, but they're really just English language learners having challenges and going through that developmental process. Special education isn't where they need to be. We need to make our English language learning services and bilingual services and culturally responsive environments, broaden those programs to serve them. So that's where sometimes there's over-identification because we don't necessarily have the services that we need for English languages. And under-identification, I think people are a little bit nervous because they're wondering, well, they're English languagers. Of course, maybe they're having challenges because of that. And so people are a little bit nervous to go the route of special education. But what we know is that our English languagers who also have specific language impairment, learning disabilities, reading difficulties are really already in our schools. They're already there. So it's really about building systems that allow us to find those students in a timely manner so we can support them. So making our systems more culturally linguistically responsive and building ESL, bilingual programming, dual immersion programming allows us to really be able to see those students in multiple contexts that are appropriate for them, and we're able to find them. But I think that's, from the 30,000. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right, so basically, the MTSS process is for us to rule out general education before we even engage in conversations related to referral for special education. However, knowing, of course, that there are situations where referral is made or it's necessary, and of course that holds true. However, the focus right now is in all issues related to over and under identification to focus on the MTSS process before special education referral. We're all familiar with the graphics and the continuum of support provided, also how it takes into account RTI principles as well as PBIS principles, bringing it together so we can address social emotional needs, academic needs, and behavioral needs, again, as this framework. Keeping all of this in mind is going to be important as we engage in some conversations around all of these practices that should be found in Tier 1. And then later on in our discussion, as we start identifying what might live in Tier 2, what Tier 2 might look like, and then finally Tier 3. And it's all about establishing these effective contexts for learning. And there are many supports to be able to do so. We have California Social and Emotional Learning Guiding Principles that are listed here, again, included in the resources that will allow you to look a little bit deeper into how we adopt whole child development as the goal of education, commit to to equity, which is a statewide practice that we all are engaging in, building capacity and maximizing our partnerships with families in the community, as well as learning and improving, that continuous improvement process that is inclusive of practices that take into account all of these steps previously mentioned. Also looking at UDL principles and all of the resources put out by CAST, Orange County Department of Ed, and all of these other supports made available as we look at outcomes and how systems, how data and practices guide that journey. So let's take a quick look at the tiers of instruction. We're going to look at some resources, and then we're going to share out a Jamboard with you for you to use it as a note-taking resource that you'll be able to then take back to your sites or keep for yourself for reference. Let's jump right in. So when we're talking about tier 1, we're talking about all learners. And one of the ways that we do that is by taking a look at the Universal Design for Learning guidelines and have these guidelines be a means of us starting our planning up front, considering all learners, providing multiple means of engagement, meaning how it is that we're going to recruit interest, how are we going to sustain effort and persistence, and provide supports for self-regulation. And then moving on to providing multiple means of representation. So how is it that data, information, concepts, content is perceived? What options are we providing students for language and symbols, and how are we using these to present this information, as well as providing options for comprehension? How is it that this is going to be relayed? And then finally, providing multiple means of action and expression for our students with their own patterns of strength and weakness. Are we providing options for physical action, expression, communication, and executive functioning? Again, inclusive academic instruction for all, tier 1, all students, including students who might be having some difficulties, because the goal is that all learners are potentially going to be, with the appropriate supports, expert learners that are purposeful and motivated, that are resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal directed. The California Practitioner's Guide has taken UDL principles and embedded it within its supports. And one of the ways that it shares it out with practitioners in the field is through figure 7.4 in chapter 7, which I know is up ahead. But again, we recognize that this is for all learners and supportive of all students, including English learners, multilingual learners. So here we're going to start getting into the MTSS nitty gritty, right? We're looking at the 3 tiers of high quality core instruction. So when we're looking at the 3 tiers, it's easy for us to remember again that visual, the graphic, the longer line of students, that is all students, universal supports. Here we're focusing on EBPs, evidence-based practices, equitable, inclusive, and integrated learning that is established and supported throughout. For English learners, super key concept here. Instruction includes comprehensive ELD, integrated and designated, not either or, both. We have comprehensive assessments, which is inclusive of screeners, it's formative, progress monitoring, benchmark. And here, though it's available for all students, about 80% of students are truly accessing tier 1 supports without the need of additional supports. Then it might be that some students might require tier 2 targeted supplemental supports. As a reminder, this is still general education. Here we're looking at additional evidence-based support for students in academic, behavioral, and social emotional health, all 3 categories. Here, specific skills are targeted based on assessment results, showing that students need more than core instruction. For English learners, all interventions include integrated ELD. Okay, doesn't get ruled out. Finally, we're looking at progress monitoring occurring more frequently. And if more than 50% of students are involved, you might want to look back at your tier 1 level supports. So again, These are design elements for you to consider. So hopefully as I'm going through this table, you're reflectively thinking about the practices, whether written or unwritten, at your sites. And who might have this information if you don't? Because I recognize that for some of us in our different roles and responsibilities, we might not have access to that information up front, or we might need some clarifying points and resources, whether they be standalone resources, documents, websites, etc., or people. Then finally, as we move on to tier 3, here we're looking at more intensive, individualized supports. Again, still not special education. This is still general education. Here we're looking at few students, about 5% of students. If you have more than 5% of your students receiving tier 3 intensive individualized supports, again, a more systematic approach, reflection process, inventorying of tier 2 and tier 1 supports might be necessary. Because here we're really looking at targeted and intensive academic, behavioral, and social emotional supports for only a small number of students who need it. Because the support here has to be individualized to meet specific student needs and assessments. The progress monitoring is occurring more frequently than in tier 2, so that we can provide an opportunity for maximum acceleration. And for English learners, again, all interventions, still inclusive of integrated ELD. If you recall from our previous sessions or from your own learning, integrated ELD is that which happens at the same time as grade level content standards in all content areas. You know, those ELD supports where the ELD standards are working in tandem, hand in hand with those content grade level standards. So again, 80 to 85% of your students are making ample progress, adequate progress with academic interventions known as tier 1 supports. Now, figure 2.8 is downloadable, accessible as a standalone document for you to access either by using the link included here or by navigating back into the Padlet. And what figure 2.8 does is it organizes a tier 1 is and a tier 1 is not table. I know this was incredibly helpful for me to see it in this structure. It's one thing to look at it in a text format where it's just paragraph form, and then to see it organized in this manner, it's easy for me to process and to share out. I know that as administrators, you are in the realm of facilitating information and resources that are preferably one-pagers. So this is a great support for you and for the practitioners that work alongside with you as we aim to improve outcomes for English learners and English learners who might have potential disabilities or those that already do. So again, tier 1 core instruction, what it is, what it isn't. In the interest of time, we're not going to be spending too much time at the moment allowing you to go through the actual document, but know that it's available there for you. You can refer to it as many times as you need it. It is included in the Padlet and also as an active link within the slide deck if you download the PDF version of it. So let's move on to the next slide. So now that same structure is consistent now as we look at tier 2. Here we're looking at academic interventions, tier 2 supports specifically. So 15% of our student population here is going to be receiving tier 2 support to be able to make progress within the general education environment. So here, this is supplemental instruction, not supplanting, but it's supplementing in addition to core grade level instruction. So think of it as a layered cake. You have your foundation, your bottom round cake, and now you're going to stack this other level of support on top. So here we're having more focused and targeted interventions to specific skills, right? Here you have some indication of, is it phonics? Is it phonemic awareness? Is it decoding? Is it fluency? Here you have a little bit more information that is more detailed so that you may target specific skills. And again, this table goes through all of those steps, what it is, what it isn't. I want to call your attention to 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 down the line to again, know that explicit instruction for English learners has to be aligned to the ELD standards, because in tier 2, we're not replacing it. It continues. So now that we have a firmer grasp of what tier 1 is, what tier 1 isn't, what tier 2 is, what tier 3 isn't, this is one of my favorites. So this again gives you a quick reference to see what a tier 2 intervention would look like and what a tier 3 intervention would look like. Again, the human brain, as my friend Lupita says, craves organization. And this gives my brain exactly what it needs in relation to the tiers of intervention. Now I have a go-to resource that illustrates and organizes the differences and similarities in a table format for tier 2 and tier 3, inclusive of minutes and days per week. It also gives you some information related to the level of diagnostic assessment, opportunities to response. It's the OTR that you see there. When having an instructional focus, behavioral expectations, the type of error correction feedback you might give, and the scaffolding supports suggested as well. So again, tier 2 versus tier 3. Because I wanted to make sure that this was accessible to all and that the content makes its way to us and to the people that we work with, practitioners that support us in this meaningful work, Lupita went ahead and developed these infographics that are available for you to download, print out, or share out electronically that give you a visual representation of what tier 1 core instruction is, what tier 2 intervention is, and what tier 3 intervention is. So again, resources available to you to take this back to staff, to your sites, to the teams you support, so that you can engage in some professional learning and some refreshers, so that you can now have a more focused discussion or refine what's already existing, or to serve as a, you know what, good job. We are doing exactly what needs to be happening, because we know that great work is happening statewide as well. So like I said, because we know that this is for you as administrators, it's sometimes important for us to have something that we can share out as a means of illustrating our thinking process, our strategies, how it is that we are engaging in these discussions. So this is an activity that we wanted to provide for you as a toolkit, so that when you return to your sites, should you wish to engage in this work with your PLC, your community of practice, this Jamboard activity is accessible to you. It will prompt you to generate a copy, and it gives you an opportunity individually or as a team to generate lists of what currently exists in your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 supports. It also gives you a space for you to document anything that you notice, any wonderings that might still be in place. So to show you how that would work, I'm going to go ahead and click it open. It's going to prompt you to make a copy. Once you make a copy, it will generate the Jamboard template for you. You'll see that as a team, if you're working in teams, you can identify what exists at your school district by either using the stickies or the text boxes. You'll see that we have a variety of slides up at the top. I embedded this one that gives you an idea as to what the tools are. It has the tier 1 figure embedded, tier 2, and it gives you some ideas as to what you may want to annotate. The tier 2, tier 3 comparison, how to modify, add more slides to this Jamboard, and that is available for you to access and take back to your teams. because we know that despite whatever scaffolds and supports and tiered interventions as part of our MTSS framework that we have, we still have to consider the individual who's at the center, right? We want to ensure that we're validating, affirming, building, and bridging, considering all elements of who these students are, the individual, from culture to ethnicity, disability, race, sexuality, gender. All of this has an impact on how it is that our students engage in the education system and the system that we establish, the environments that we establish. Figure 2.6 allows us to refer back to some culturally and linguistically sustaining practices that are going to strengthen our tier 1 supports, our tier 1 instruction, our core instruction, and our tier 2 and tier 3 supports. And that's inclusive of us recognizing how to use cultural and linguistic knowledge, home and community experiences, and learning styles, also by integrating history and culture into the curriculum to give them a sense of belonging, as well as helping develop and strengthen and support healthy perceptions of cultural and linguistic identity, as well as other levels of proficiency and critical awareness, so that we can fully develop students who have personal efficacy and cultural pride. That was a lot, I recognize that. So I want to give you a couple of minutes for you to just pause, process, and use the chat feature to connect with us. We love engaging with you. So if you had any aha moments or something you'd like to share, perhaps a promising practice at your school site, any questions or requests for supports that you might have, feel free to drop those into the chat. We are very much interested in your feedback, and we'll refer to the chat often to ensure that we are addressing all of your needs. While you do that, I'm going to ask Lupita, do you want me to keep driving? Or do you want to drive for the remainder of the afternoon?
Oh, do you mind just being my driver today?
I can be your driver today.
Absolutely. I think there's one more slide with some reflective questions, just to kind of closing thoughts that are going to help you really think about what are some current practices, what might be evident and visible from your perspective as an administrator in your respective roles. What might you be wondering about in respect to the tiers of instruction? And maybe you're thinking about, you know, does everybody have this common understanding of what the differences and similarities might be between the different tiers of instruction, and how decisions are made, information gathered and monitored, student data gathered and monitored to make sound decisions about providing the appropriate supports for students. Again, so these questions are afforded for you here to help you think about your current practices and the lens that you're seeing these practices depending on your respective role. So I am being mindful of the time. Please know that all of the resources, including these questions, are provided for you in the Padlet within the slide deck as well. So you have multiple ways of accessing them. In case you prefer for them to be standalone, you can find them in our chapter 2 column of the Padlet, as well as they're linked onto each of the sections of the slide as well. All righty, we're going to move on to the next slide. So Vanessa walked us through kind of an overview of the tiers of instruction. And it's important for us to focus on comprehensive ELD as tier 1 core instruction. So for the next half hour or so, we're going to be focusing on what comprehensive ELD is and what it means for English learners and English learners with disabilities. Next slide, please. So to start us off, we pulled this quote out from the Practitioner's Guide, and it's a critical question and things to think about. Again, regardless of your role as an administrator, these are important questions to ask of our staff, of our colleagues, of ourselves. So when English learners are not making progress, it's imperative that we ask ourselves, what is the quality of instruction up to par? In other words, are we providing comprehensive ELD for English learners as part of their tier 1 core instruction? Are the standards, ELD standards, being used to design and deliver ELD instruction? Are we taking into consideration students' strengths, weaknesses, cultural aspects, extrinsic factors that may impact their learning? Are we taking a look at the whole child? And are we using the different elements of the MTSS framework to help us design and provide the appropriate supports for all of our students, particularly in the topic of today, our English learners and our English learners with disabilities? So this is a critical question to have in mind as we navigate through and reflect upon our current practices and processes to ensure that we are providing what students absolutely need and what is required. Next slide, please. So again, as a reminder, all English learners are to receive comprehensive ELD. It is part of their Tier 1 core instruction, for which includes both designated and integrated ELD. And this is true for English learners with disabilities as well. It is not in lieu of, or now that you have a 504 or an IEP, we're going to remove comprehensive ELD. No, it is supposed to be part of their core instruction for all English learners. Next slide, please. So there are two types of English language instruction as defined by our wonderful state here in the state of California. So comprehensive ELD is comprised of two types of ELD instruction, each one of them with a specific purpose and goal. So we know them as integrated and designated ELD. So I'm going to give you a quick kind of description of what they are and what their respective purposes and goals are. So for integrated ELD, the purpose of integrated ELD for English learners is for them to have access to the content across all disciplines. And how that is done is by using the ELD standards to scaffold the content and differentiate the tasks, the language tasks specifically, based on the student's language proficiency level as determined by the LPAC. Designated ELD, on the other hand, the purpose of designated ELD is to provide explicit instruction of English language development so that students progress through English language acquisition, through all those levels of English language acquisition, and ultimately master the English language. In the goal of, again, designated ELD is for English language mastery. For both integrated and designated ELD, the ELD standards are designed to help support teachers create lessons and deliver lessons. One more thing about designated ELD that I failed to mention is in the case of designated ELD, English learners are grouped by like proficiency levels. In integrated ELD, because it happens throughout the instructional day across the disciplines, students are going to be alongside English only students and other language proficiency level English learners. Next slide, please. So we have an activity here that, again, for the sake of time, we won't be able to engage in, but know that we've provided a resource for you to be able to easily access it and use it, and perhaps even share with your staff or leaders in helping everybody have a common understanding of what comprehensive ELD is. We've taken this wonderful activity from the belief modules. We always give credit where credit is due. And actually Vanessa modified it to just make it a little bit easier for us to be able to use throughout all of our professional development. And again, it's an opportunity for staff, educators, leaders, administrators to engage in an activity to help develop a common understanding of the different characteristics of comprehensive ELD. I'm going to walk you through how this all plays out, kind of give you the fast forward of the after a Venn diagram activity is completed, just to kind of give you an overview of what some of the characteristics may look like. So once it's all said and done, the components, some of the components or characteristics of comprehensive ELD can be captured here in this slide via this Venn diagram. So I'm going to focus on integrated ELD, the blue text in the slide. So when we're talking about integrated ELD, we're talking about English language instruction that happens across the content area, and it goes above and beyond designated ELD. The focus is on language content and language objectives. So we're scaffolding the content and provided supports for language objective based on the student's language proficiency level. The ELD standards are used in tandem with the content standards. Because it is across the content area and throughout all disciplines, any and all students can benefit from integrated ELD. However, it is required of for English learners. In the right side, or my right side, the red text for designated ELD, the focus here is the language development. The ELD standards are the focal standards for this part of the instructional day. You will be focusing on specific language objectives based on the group of students, that is their language proficiency, to help them move from one language proficiency level to the other. This is a protected time of the day, and it does occur daily. It is not necessarily a once in a while, or let's fit it into the latter part of the day every other Wednesday and Thursday. It is part of your instructional day for English learners. English learners are grouped by proficiency level, and the very specific demands of the lesson is based on the student's proficiency level. That is, we're focusing on the different elements, listening, speaking, reading, and writing of the student based on his or her language proficiency level. Next slide, please. So in order to provide access to CORE, we have to provide English language development instruction. And in order to do that effectively, we use the ELD standard. So this graphic represents the different components of the ELD standards. I like to use it to give folks kind of an overview of the design and organization of the standards to help them better understand the design, and therefore help folks better understand the purpose of implementing them the way that they are designed. So as you can see here by the organization, there are 3 parts. I'm going to walk you through each one of the parts, and hopefully I'll do a good job of helping you see how these parts, although in the graphic are shown separately, are designed to be integrated in terms of their implementation. So let's focus on part 1. Part 1 of the ELD standards has its own cluster of standards. And the purpose of part 1 of the ELD standards is to provide students opportunities to use language in meaningful ways. And how they do that is by being afforded time during their ELD instructional time to interact with each other, with their peers, with the teachers or the adults in the room who are facilitating the lesson, to engage in authentic language use based on what they are reading and listening. So let me move into part 2 now. So part 2 of the ELD standards also has its own cluster of standards. However, the purpose of part 2 of ELD standards is to really focus in on the forms of English, how English is used, and how to make meaning by analyzing language in a variety of text, informational text, literature text. So it's important for students to be afforded time to engage in and provided scaffolds to dig into the different types of text and analyze the language for the purpose of meaning making. So that arrow in between part 1 and part 2 represents how both of these clusters of standards are designed to be integrated and to work together. That is, what students are learning about how the English language works in part 1, once they have a good sense of meaning making and how words and phrases come together to make meaning, then they apply it and practice it through the different opportunities afforded to them through part 1 ELD standards. That is, we teach them what English is about, and then they practice it through the different types of standards used to help them interact in meaningful ways. So part 2 is the what you learn. Part 1 is the how you learn it. So let me focus your eyes down towards the bottom of this graphic and you'll see part 3 way at the bottom. So part 3 are indeed our Common Core foundational literacy skills that are designed for kinder through 3rd grade. For some English learners with gaps in literacy and in their primary language, it's imperative for us to use the foundational literacy skills that are designed in the Common Core standards to help fill those literacy gaps in English. The key here is to use their primary language as a platform to do that, to help make connections or bridge the skills that they already have, particularly in oral and written language in their primary language, and start bridging that towards the English. This is easier to do with Spanish speakers than it is with other multilingual learners that perhaps have a language that is not similar to English in terms of the alphabet and the directionality of how they read and write. So it's important to take that into consideration when using Part 3 foundational literacy skill standards as a way to build literacy for our multilingual learners. And then still finishing off at the bottom of this graphic, we have the proficiency levels. The new ELD, I say new, but they're not really new. They were pushed out in 2012, but the ELD standards called for moving from 5 language proficiency levels to 3 language proficiency levels. And that's what you see here at the bottom of this graphic, the emerging, the expanding, and the bridging level. But I want you to take note of those arrows before, in the middle, and after each one of those proficiency levels, because they represent the progression of language and how language doesn't fit in a box. It's important to take into consideration that students who the LPAC indicates are perhaps at an emerging level, we want to take into consideration that they bring in some language skills, both in their primary language and perhaps even in English, that are going to help them move along towards the next proficiency level. So it focuses us on considering that language does not fit in a box, and as students are progressing from one level to the next, we're going to see proficiencies in different aspects of language. And I'm going to talk about that, I think, is the next slide. So Vanessa, let's move right along. I'm taking note of the time, folks. So can you just click away so we can get, thank you so much. So this graphic represents the general progression of the ELD continuum. It is adapted from the ELD standards, but what I want to highlight here is what I started to say towards the end of the previous slide. This shows a natural progression of English language acquisition for English learners, for all English learners. And it's important to take note that in some cases, when students are progressing through and learning more language, more vocabulary, more phrases, and are becoming bolder in using and experimenting and trying out the language in different contexts, that we might take notice that some skills are perhaps more proficient than others. Sometimes we hear students English, oral English in such a way that we feel, oh, these kids are proficient in English. Yet when we ask them to read for comprehension or to write, those skills are not up to the proficiency that perhaps their oral language skills are. So just want to take note that that is typical of a progression of English language acquisition for all English learners, including English learners with disabilities. I say that because it's important for us to consider these two things. When we note that students or English learners are not progressing, and we take notice of this, their proficiency in oral language is better than written language, there might be a disability. Take note that that is typical of language acquisition. And so it does not automatically point us to a language illiteracy gap that automatically takes us down the referral path. The same is true for English learners with an active IEP or a 504. It is a natural progression of English language acquisition to have proficiency in some domains of English, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and them not all be at the same proficiency level. So this is not representative of their disability, however, very natural and typical representation of language acquisition. I hope that was clear, and I hope it's something that you think about as you are considering a potential referral or as you're considering the supports for an English learner with an IEP. Next, please. So again, another thing that I want to point out is our long-term English learners. So these are our kiddos who have been in our system for quite a while, have been in our academic system for quite a while, and are still not progressing as we desire them to progress. So for these kiddos, we want to take a close look at what type of English language instruction, comprehensive ELD have they been receiving? Have they been progress monitoring? Has that happened? Have we looked at what areas they may have needed more additional support, or has there been an interruption in that? You know, so it's important for us to look back, look a little bit at the history of what these kiddos have received, how well have they been faring in terms of comprehensive ELD and other content areas, and what types of supports might have been provided for them or not. Again, before we make the determination that perhaps they need a referral for possible special education services. For these kiddos, it's important for us to take a look at and focus on part 2 of the ELD standards, how the English language works, and really diving into varied texts and scaffolding for meaning making. And again, affording them opportunities to use this language with additional supports. Next slide, please. So again, pause and process, and we have a handful of minutes as we're closing out our time here together. These questions are really designed for educators, for teachers who are working directly with our English learners. But we put them in here because it's going to help you as administrators be thinking about what to look for, be able to engage in conversations with your ELD teachers, with the case managers who are working towards implementing ELD standards. And again, it's a resource for everybody to either have conversations about what our ELD instruction looks like, as well as designing well-crafted ELD lessons for all of our students. Next slide, please. And every chapter of this practitioner's guide has student scenarios. In this case, for chapter 2, there are 2 student scenarios. We've pulled out our sweet little cruise here as the student scenario that we're asking you to spend some time on as soon as you can, because this particular scenario really gives us an idea of the different systems that are in place that will afford us to make a sound decision about providing tier 2 and possibly tier 3 instruction. So it presumes that tier 1 instruction has happened, that all the pieces are in place, and yet Little Cruz is still needing some extra support. So reading through this scenario will give you an idea of what systems in place looks like that will point us into making a sound decision about moving towards tier 2 instruction, possibly tier 3, as we want to ensure that we're affording kids all of the supports that they need, that we're having conversations with the different lenses, your EL leads, your instructional coaches, your reading coaches in this case for Little Cruz, you know, your foundational skills is an area that we're looking at, and making sure that the next step is the appropriate next step. Next slide. And last but not least, we've readapted these resources that we use often with our teams and designed them specifically for you as administrators. We've provided you a note-taking guide that you can use for yourself with your staff that will take them back to the 2 components that we covered for you today. So Vanessa, can you click on the note-taking guide real quick, please? Thank you so much. So this note-taking guide, you'll see, has the questions, the pause and process questions that Vanessa walked us through in her section of tiers of instruction, as well as a table to help navigate conversations, take note of what resources might be necessary to maybe fill some gaps or to enhance current practices and some possible next steps, as well as for the comprehensive ELD section of today. Again, what are your findings? What are some resources that are available to us or that we might need to seek out, and some actionable steps. And then the different activities and infographics and additional resources to help you have, I almost want to call it kind of like a mini staff development to go in this 1-pager. Again, it's going to help you as participants go back to many of the topics that we referred to today in an easier way, more manageable way, as well as it can be used to help design professional development for your staff or other leaders at your site. I think that is all for me. Vanessa, can you bring us back to the slide deck, pretty please? We've given you a lot, folks. Again, we know that you as leaders carry this huge responsibility to ensure that not only our students are receiving quality instruction, but that teachers are afforded the training and resources to help them do that for all of our students. So with that, we want to thank you for your time. We do want to give you some time for final thoughts or questions that you have for us. We will hang back a little bit after the hour. Should you want to ask some specific questions of us, we are happy to support you. Know that this training is being recorded and it will be pushed out to all our registered participants. You have access to our slide deck via the Padlet, as well as additional resources that we shared with you today. And with that, I want to hand it back to Dr. Deborah Montoya for some final thoughts.
Hello, everyone, and sorry again that my camera doesn't seem to be working, but I wanted to thank you all for your time. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat box. We like to hang back. We don't want to close it out on anyone and be bad hosts, because we know that your questions are many and everything that you're doing at the school site. Again, we commend you not only for being here, but everything that you do in your scope of work. We look forward to seeing you next time for what is Chapter 3 and discussing all things pre-referral. In the event that you have tried all tiers of intervention, where do we go next when we have suspicions, and considering language difference versus disability and potential need for special education evaluation. So we look forward to seeing you at our next session. And again, feel free to reach out to us. Know that these resources are available free to you for reuse, remaking, and applying as you see appropriate in your respective school district, school site, our county office, or SELPA. So thank you again. Have the wonderful rest of your week,